Great. Well, I don't think I need to introduce Anna, except to say that we're very sorry that she's leaving, but absolutely delighted that she has a tenure-track position at the Catholic University of Australia in the Great Books section. So well done, Anna. That's really absolutely wonderful news, and thank you for all that you've done in the last couple of years.
Yes.
So Anna is going to be talking about philosophers, songbirds, and bees, Plotinus and the soul's journey through different levels of consciousness.
Thank you, Douglas. So why a paper on Plotinus in a conference on panpsychism? And I have to thank Denis because you introduced the idea of an undescended soul. So a soul that I would call in this paper the contemplator of forms, that is disembodied, still it belongs to us. And as Plotinus says, is our ideal and truest self. And we don't become aware of this contemplator of forms during our embodied existence unless we are, as Denis said, in rare occasions. Maybe Plotinus did while he was incarnated. I know there's scholarly disagreement about this as well. So it's very important to keep in mind this concept of an undescended self that we are not aware of. When we will be talking about reincarnation in my paper. I'm pretty sure that anyone with some knowledge of Plotinus would expect in a conference like this a paper on NS 3.8, where Plotinus famously claimed that nature is engaged in a form of cognitive activity, which he calls in Greek theoria, and which that is usually translated as contemplation, and which refers to a sort of non-representational and non-discursive form of consciousness, similar to that of someone asleep. However, I have decided not to speak on this treatise today, mainly because a brilliant paper on Plotinus and Panpsychism, mainly based on this treatise on 3.8, has been recently published by Lloyd Gerson, and I don't have much to add to what he said. So I've decided to speak about Plotinus's view of consciousness and reincarnation, hoping to show both the beauty of Plotinus' position and some grounds for comparison with recent discussions on consciousness. However, I think that before delving into reincarnation, a few words on nature and contemplation are due. As I said, Plotinus believed that the whole of nature, including trees and the earth that produces them, contemplates, and that the emergence and development of natural organisms, including plants, amoebas, and even minerals that grow within the earth, are speculative activities in every respect. Take the following passage. Now let us talk about the earth itself and trees and plants in general, and ask what their contemplation theoria is, and how we can relate what the earth makes and produces to its activity of contemplation, and how nature, which people say has no power of forming mental images or reasoning, has contemplation in itself and makes what it makes by contemplation, which it doesn't have. Plotinus goes as far as to imagine that if someone were to ask nature itself in which respect nature, is said to contemplate, nature would reply, "What comes into being, it's what I see in my silence, an object of contemplation which comes to be naturally, and that I, originating from this sort of contemplation, have a contemplative nature. And my act of contemplation makes what it contemplates, as the geometers draw their figures while they contemplate. But I don't draw, but as I contemplate, the lines which bound bodies come to be as if they fell from my contemplation." In these two beautiful passages, I'd like to stress the idea of an active relationship of causality between theoria, contemplation, and poiesis, production. And the important fact that for Plotinus, theoria is at every level, a poietic act. Contemplation is nature being driven by the compelling desire to reach outside itself and generate new life. It's the need of being to transcend itself. It's essential necessity to become production on an intellectual as well as on a material level. So just as the genetic makeup of an individual presupposes a reading or a decoding inherent in his or her biological structure, so the creation, maintenance, and alteration of phenomena in the physical world involves nature's understanding of the mechanisms underlying its own work. This understanding is the ability to read, retain, and process information in an effective way aimed at the emergence of the sensible world. Readers of this treatise, and in particular of these passages, might note certain similarities in what Plotinus says with what contemporary panpsychists say. Yet, the cognition found in, let's say, a sunflower or an orchid could be explained in fundamentally opposed ways by Plotinus and a contemporary panpsychist. For Plotinus, this sort of narcotic understanding of the sunflower is the result of the presence of the divine and of soul in the sunflower. For the contemporary panpsychist, I assume, is the result of the presence of some property or mentality or mind. In fact, from this perspective, panpsychism could be seen as a form of radically anti-Platonic or anti-Plotinian naturalism, insofar as it denies a higher principle, Platonically speaking here, the anima mundi, the soul of the world, via which conscious cognitive activities are present in non-living beings. For this reason, I have decided not to go down the path of a possible comparison between Plotinus and contemporary panpsychism, even though I was very tempted to do so. So I will be focusing on Plotinus' view of consciousness as it emerged from his account of reincarnation. So let's start from a quite long passage from NS 342, where Plotinus describes the possible scenarios that wait for us after death. And this passage explains the title and the image of the concert of birds. This beautiful Franz Snyder painting. So this is the passage. Those men who guarded the man in them become men again. Those who lived by sense alone become animals. But if their self-perceptions have been accompanied by passionate temper, they become wild animals. And the difference in temper in them makes the difference between the animals of this kind. Those whose sense-perception went with desire of the flesh and the delight of the desiring part of the soul become lustful and gluttonous animals. But if they didn't even live by sense along with their desires, but coupled them with dullness of perception, they even turn into plants. For it was this, the growth principle, which worked in them, alone or predominantly, and they were taking care to turn themselves into trees. Those who loved music but were in other ways respectable turned into songbirds. Kings who ruled stupidly into eagles, if they had no other vices. Astronomers who were always raising themselves to the sky without philosophical reflection turned into birds which fly high. The man who practiced community virtue becomes a man again, but one who has a lesser share of it, a creature that lives in a community, a bee or something of the sort. Plotinus is aware that reincarnation into animals or into plants might sound absurd, since the human soul is the forming principle of a man. But for him, there's no such a thing as a human soul. or a horse soul, or an orchid soul, or a sunflower soul. Each individual soul has within itself the lives and identities of all individuals inhabiting the universe. And what seems to be a startling ontological transfiguration is actually only a change of status within the same nature, a shift in dominance from the higher to the lower. At the core of this discussion is the difference between soul, psyche, and the forming principle, belonging to soul, the logos. And more specifically, the belief that a human being is a logos, is a rational forming principle different other than soul. So the individual soul of each individual, man or woman for Plotinus, extends far beyond human nature. In fact, human nature is just one of the many manifestations or identities of each individual soul. His view is that the individual soul contains the logoi, the forming principles of all individual beings existing in the cosmos, including those of non-human individuals. Take this other passage. If the soul of each individual possesses the rational forming principle of all the individuals which animates in succession, then again, on this assumption, all will exist there. And we say that each soul possesses all the forming principles in the universe. If then the universe possesses the forming principles not only of man, but of all individual animals, so does the soul. In Ennead 676, Plotinus intertwines this idea of a forming principle present within one individual soul with transmigration. He says, but when, having chosen the nature of an animal, the soul that was associated with that nature, even when it was a man, follows that nature, then the soul, Edoken, brings out the forming principle of that animal, which it possesses within itself. For the soul possesses this principle, which is its lower activity. So, for Plotinus, the logos, the principle that is more congenital to the soul, is the rational forming principle that produces a human rather than a non-human being. Plotinus says that by nature, the soul wills a man and is a man. However, if the soul cannot produce a human being, it makes what it can. So the logos of an animal is not the truest to the human soul's nature, but is nevertheless a part of it. The principle which made a horse or ox, Plotinus explains, is a lesser thing, but certainly is not unnatural to the soul. Hence, the soul informing a horse is not different from the one that once informed a human being. It's the same soul agent acting at a lower ontological level. The soul is thus the locus of all different activities that can stretch not only from discarnate to incarnate life, so to the contemplator of form, to my biographical self, but also from human to animal life. To quote again Lloyd Gerson, he said, even if the puppy in the litter is not the reincarnation of Socrates, it belongs to a family of incarnation which could, and perhaps eventually will, include a man. Now, in order to fully understand Plotinus's view of different levels of consciousness and how these relate to reincarnation, we must introduce Plotinus' notion of guardian demon, which he derives from Plato, by which it identifies with a faculty of the soul, with a psychological power. More specifically, with a faculty which is immediately superior to the one which is the main characteristic of our personality. For example, if we live by sense perception, our demon will be reason. If we live by reason, our demon will be intellect. if we live by nature, the vegetative function, as you said, the breathing, the sanguification, the growing of the hair and nails, our demon will be sense perception. I didn't include the faculty of the imagination here, just because Plotinus didn't speak of the imagination in the context of the demon and reincarnation. So take this passage. What worked in a man lives him after death, since it was his ruler and guide here too. Is this the demon to whom he was allotted while he lived? Here is quoting Plato. No, but that which is before the working principle. For this, the demon presides inactive over the man, but that which comes after it acts. If the working principle is that by which we have sense perception, the demon is the rational principle. But if we live by the rational principle, the demon is what is above this, presiding inactive and giving its consent to the principle which works. Plotinus is stressing the difference between a principle that is active in us, and which he calls in Greek to energun, the main trait of our personality, the working principle, and one which is above this and presides inactive, which he calls the guardian demon. So despite the notorious obscurity of these lines, Plotinus makes one point clear. The nature of our guardian demon is determined by the psychic power that is most active in us. The demon watches over the soul, but doesn't intervene in the soul choices, at least not in the way that we would expect. So apparently the demon carries out its supervisory duties by sitting idle on its high lookout. However, it's harder to believe that there's nothing more to this story. To anyone with some knowledge of Plotinus psychology, the idea of a split between two poles, the demon and the working principle, seems to fit uneasily with the view that the soul has a unitary nature. Indeed, the demon's idleness is far from a lack of involvement in an individual's pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving. On the contrary, the focal point of our personality is not the working principle alone, but the working principle in relation to the demon. In other words, our conscious life in relation to our unconscious life, which Plotinus says gives its consent. So Plotinus' view, I take it, is that an individual who lives following reason is rational, not simply because her or his behavior shows a wise understanding and practice, but also because he or she acts on an epistemological and moral level, which is the closest as possible to intellect, and which intellect continuously certifies and preserves from decline. Intellect, alias the demon, is not simply present to the working principle, but acts as a pole of attraction that keeps the core of one personality directed upwards. If this balance of forces is kept throughout the incarnated life, after death, the soul's active principle will be upgraded, so to speak, from reason to intellect, and this guardian demon from a demon to a god. So if we look at the matter from this perspective, it becomes clearer that the demon described by Plotinus contributes actively to the soul's life in at least two ways. It keeps the center of psychological gravity both unchanged and oriented upwards, and promotes the soul epistrophe, that is the return to the divine principle, the good, through different cycles of incarnation. In the former case, the demon's fulfilling action is performed within the course of a single life. For both the working principle and the demon change from one life to another. In the latter case, the demon's action is, so to speak, long-term and aims at the ultimate emancipation of the soul from life in the cosmos. Case 2 requires one or more incarnations and different demons. It is achieved by, as it were, the passing of the guardian's demon baton to a demon that is each time nobler. Case 2 relies on case 1, for one can upgrade from one previous demon only if, in the past life, one has remained truthful to one's working principle, that is, if one has not sunk lower than the nature one chose before incarnation. The goal of each single life is to transform inactivity into activity, unconsciousness into consciousness, that is, to transform the demon's unperceived presence into the working principle. The goal of the whole cycle of incarnations, by contrast, is the abandonment of demonic life, that is, incarnated life, and the attainment of divine life. The demon's guardianship, acting as an upward pole of attraction, facilitates the progressive misidentification of the soul with its embodied activities and its identification with discarnated thought, with the contemplator of forms. In this way, the demon can be seen as facilitating the psychological continuity between different levels of operation of the soul and different levels of consciousness. So we have said that Plotinus considers the soul as the locus of both embodied and disembodied activities, conscious and unconscious ones. However, these antonymic adjectives don't refer to the activities of two different souls, but to different ontological and psychological states of the same soul. Within the soul, we said that we can further identify two dimensions of the self. The incarnate individual, that is the one that makes the choice of its identity, and the subject of disembodied thinking. Even though they belong to the same soul, the two selves seem to be unrelated. For as we've seen, the incarnate self never becomes aware of the activity of the discarnate self. And in the discarnate self, the incarnate self is obliterated. Yet, as I said, the bifurcation between two selves seems contrary to Plotinus' idea of soul and to his metaphysics in general, in which reality is conceived as a systematic unity. Moreover, Plotinus' description of the psychological and moral ascent to the good depends on the idea that the incarnate self aims for, or at least should aim for, the activity of the discarnate self. So if the one aims for the other, there must be a sort of psychological continuity. In other words, the contemplator of forms must be the same I that performs discursive thinking, remembers her childhood, digests her dinner. But what guarantees the continuity between these states of consciousness? The problem of psychological continuity has long vexed philosophers, as we know. Many, most notably John Locke, explain it in terms of autobiographical memory. For Plotinus, however, memory couldn't account for the psychological continuity, only of the embodied self, for the disembodied self is outside of time. Once the soul, Plotinus says, flies from multiplicity and gathers multiplicity into one, the soul becomes forgetful of its embodied past. Hence, for Plotinus, memory cannot bridge the gap between eternity and time, between the embodied and the disembodied self. So, if the incarnate self wants to become the discarnate self, it's not because he remembers the discarnate self. It's nor, as we have seen, because the incarnate self perceives the discarnate self, for the discarnate self's presence is unperceived. Consequently, not even consciousness can account for self-continuity across time and eternity. What is it then that guarantees this continuity? It is desire. The incarnate self aspires to be identified with the contemplator of forms because it desires the contemplator of forms. This desire, I take it, is inspired by the demon. and Plotinus calls the demon Eros, desire. As we said, demonic guardianship is needed to allow the soul to remain as truthful as possible to the thing chosen, that is, to the working principle that the soul selected before incarnation. Interestingly, Plotinus' description of how specifically the demon carries out this task relies on the imagery and language of craving and desiring. Plotinus says that the demon implants the desire appropriate to the nature of each individual soul. The individual soul longs for what corresponds to its own nature and produces a love which accords with its value, worth, and its proportion to its being. Now, to conclude, as we have seen, for Plotinus, the soul's descent from the intelligible to the natural world doesn't entail a loss of the noble levels of psychological operation, but only their deactivation. Likewise, the soul's return to the intelligible is not the recovery of those levels, but their reactivation. The guardian demon, as the erotic disposition towards the good, promotes the turning, the strophe of the soul towards the epistrophe of the soul towards higher principles through a transition from unconsciousness into consciousness that will eventually flow into the disconnect self. He says, but if a man is able to follow the demon which is above him, he comes to be himself above, leaving the demon's side and giving the preeminence to that better part of himself to which is being led. And after that demon, he rises to another until he reaches the heights. The journey of Plotinus' undescended soul is not a journey in space, for the soul doesn't depart specially from its abode. It's not even a journey through time, at least not entirely, for the journey begins and ends outside of time. Rather, it's a journey through different levels of consciousness, which are progressively deactivated and activated as the soul descends and ascends. Of the unconscious levels, that one that stands at the threshold of consciousness is the demon. Thus, its presence has an unperceived yet direct influence on the core of psychological life. As the desire for what is above, the demon prevents the psychological core from fluctuating downwards and the soul from wandering further away from its home. In doing so, it promotes through different lives, through different incarnations, the identification of the soul with the contemplator of forms, which is not metaphysically remote, but is and has always been available to us. Now, Rupert Sheldrake debated the possibility that what we do and experience, and most notably our memory, are not stored in our brains, but have some kind of external existence and persistence outside of our physical body and beyond our biographical self. In Plotinus, this non-bodily, extra-biographical dimension of one experience works both vertically and horizontally. Vertically, as the higher essential self, the contemplator of forms, is not merged with the incarnate biographical subject. As we have seen, it doesn't even inhabit the body. It doesn't even inhabit this region of the universe. Yet, it belongs to us. It is us. To this, one should add that the extra-biographical dimension of one's experience for Plotinus is confirmed by the fact that self-awareness and even consciousness are not constitutive of our identity. This is the point that I was making. I think it's quite the opposite. I think that it's when we are least aware of ourselves as discarnate contemplators that we are most ourselves. So each individual soul stretches vertically from the vegetative life of plants to discarnate contemplation, beyond our historical biographical self. Plotinus says the soul is many things, and all things, both the things above and the thing below, down to the limits of all life. And we are, each one of us, an intelligible universe, making contact with this lower world by the powers of soul below, but with the intelligible world by its power above and the powers of the universe. And we remain with all the rest of our intelligible parts above, but by its ultimate fringe, we are tied to the world below. Plotinus posits an important distinction between soul as the agent of all powers of which we are capable, and the soul as the agent of the powers which we consciously enact. For soul is not the contemplator of forms, is not a man, is not an horse, is not a plant. Soul is the power to become all of these things. In this sense, the soul's extra-biographical experience extends not only vertically, but also horizontally, as different and non-simultaneously empirical individual incarnation of the same soul, enacting different formative principles, different logoi, are possible and indeed happen. Now, as I said at the beginning of this paper, if there is anything as Panpsychism in Plotinus, this is very different from that of contemporary thinkers. Yet his view that individuals, be these men, animals, or plants, are but temporary instantiation of one individual soul acting at different levels of operations, I think this view resonates deeply with contemporary debates on the diminishing and increase of the complexity of experience across the scale of nature. In its simple and elegant hypothesis that non-human consciousness, down, as Denis said, to the unsold minerals that grow within the earth, so that this non-human consciousness is not different from, but continues with human consciousness. So in this hypothesis, I think the richness of nature is accounted for in terms of an intrinsic harmony between only apparently opposite levels of life and being, only apparently opposite. Thank you.
Very much indeed, Anna, your paper. So, questions?
Yes.
Thank you, that's very fascinating. It's totally, I don't know a lot about the details of Plotinus, it's very interesting. I think my question might be unanswerable, but you've been thinking about the connection to contemporary panpsychism. I guess I'm curious about how it might connect to a very different bit of philosophical history. Descartes, so Descartes has the core of consciousness and self, the I, the thinking I that can't be doubted. If you had to, where do you think how Plotinus might, which of these entities you prefer to might be most connected to that, or would that just be too alien to Plotinus's whole way of thinking?
Well, this is a very interesting question. It's difficult to reply because in Descartes, starting with Descartes, we lose the concept of soul, as Plotinus and the ancient Greeks had the concept of soul, the psyche, the thing that the vital breath that gives life to the body. So I don't think that if we think about the embodied self cannot be thought of without the concept of soul that involves all these levels of consciousness.
Is that more of an Aristotelian notion of soul? Excuse my ignorance.
In Plotinus?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Right.
Yes. Yeah. As Denis said, is the soul that pervades the whole body, and the soul that keeps the soma alive, the living body alive, as opposed to the necros, so that is the body without the psyche, the body without the soul. As I said, probably would be discursive thinking. the level of reason, the Cartesian mind that is below intellect. Intellect is already above and beyond the discursive thinking, is pure contemplation. And that is almost closer to the kind of contact where the difference between subject and object is obliterated that Denise was speaking of. So there is, I think, the closer concept to Descartes' notion of mind probably would be discursive thinking, dianoia in Plotinus. I don't know if the other Plotinian scholars here agree.
Just before Denis comes in, I could just add to that, that actually, ironically, was a Cambridge Neoplatonist fan of Plotinus who coined the term Cartesianism. In fact, Cartesianism predates the Cartesianism. It was Henry Moore who coined it. And that's linked to a sort of ambivalent interest in Descartes. On the one hand, Descartes as a sort of quasi-Platonist against obscenism, against materialism, but he's unhappy with Cartesianism precisely because of this mechanization of the physical world and the loss of the world soul. So that I say that's just a kind of historical thing to your question. But Denis, sorry.
Yeah, I've got a question for Anna in a moment, but maybe just as a brief point of clarification on Plotinus and Aristotle on the soul, since it came up, and maybe distinguishing it from Descartes. I think there are ways in which Plotinus' soul echoes Aristotle, but there's a major difference that I would point out. Is if you think of Aristotle's classic definition of soul in the De Anima, he'll say soul is the first grade of actuality of a body capable of life. So what does that mean, right? It means that some bodies have the capacity, a dunamis, a power, to be alive. The example of a corn planter, Socrates, but a stone doesn't. A stone still has a being, but it does not have the capacity for life. So the first grade of actuality of a body capable of life is the soul. That means that for Aristotle, the soul is what he calls an entelecheia, or what we might call a hylomorphic compound. It is both body and form. There is no soul per se that is in a kind of Cartesian separate from extended substance, right? That then gets implanted in or is indexed at a distance, however you want to understand Descartes. And in Plotinus, I think he wants to say that you can have individual souls and also an all soul that is separate from any kind of body, right? Whereas in Aristotle, the strict definition, you have a real kind of actualization of a body capable of life. I would maybe just stress
So
that.
yeah, to this point, I think that it would, when we said that for him, minerals have some kind of theoria of contemplation. Minerals, it says that grow inside the earth because those minerals are connected to the earth, so are connected to soul, to the soul of the world that informs nature and the earth. But for example, if I cut a flower or I cut a tree, that the tree would stop as it's disconnected from the earth, won't have access to the soul anymore, so it would become just a piece of wood with no life and no consciousness. So I think this is a fundamental difference, and this also for is comparison with theories of living matter. So the soul is the conditio sine qua non of life, and the one intellect through soul.
And also historically,
something about Descartes and Plotinus before Denis asks a question.
yeah, I just wanted to add just for Philip's point, that in terms of this question of Aristotelianism, if you look at the history of Western philosophy, the idea of the world soul, which is so significant for, in a way, as a kind of backdrop to contemporary discussions about panpsychism, the interest in the world soul has tended to be a Platonic Neoplatonic interest. I mean, the scholastic Aristotelians, for reasons that Denis has outlined, have tended to think it's either nonsensical or downright heretical. So there's this kind of this link between this sort of tradition of Neoplatonism and the resurgence of the idea of the world soul, whether in 12th century Chartres, whether it's the Renaissance, whether it's among kind of anti-Cartesians, and then the Romantic period. That's all linked to as well the reception of this strand of thought.
If I may, because you said, Anna, that the Anoia reason would be the Cartesian ego or thinking thing. I would see it differently, because in Plotinus, the Anoia or reason is incapable of self-reflection. So it's oriented, Plotinus says outwards, but I don't think it means outwards in this crude sense of separation between subject and object, but the reason is the experience of the logoi, of the logoi in the soul, but reason doesn't see itself. And in 5.3, Plotinus emphasizes that intellect sees itself, and through itself and in itself, it sees all things. So I would say that when Descartes says that I know that I exist, this is a noetic experience. So this is the seeing which Plotinian intellect is capable of, even if this is the only thing that Descartes shares with Plotinus, because of course for Plotinus, when I see that I exist, I also see all the forms. I see the whole being, which is not true, I think, for Descartes. But I wouldn't equate Descartes' intellect with reason, because for Plotinus, reason is oriented towards sensible reality, towards the structures of sensible reality, and only if it turns into itself and the seers, and I see the seer, then I have the experience of intellect.
Yes, are we talking about the cogito? Because in the cogito, when describing the cogito and the meditation, Descartes says clearly that it involves also imagination and sense perception. It's not the pure thinking.
Yeah, but the grasp of the fact of the existence of.
So you don't think that
of the self, it transcends all the cogitationes.
So you don't think that when we are performing, like in this very moment, we are not contemplating the form, we are performing discursive reason?
Why not?
Because we are exchanging opinion, we are discoursing, running from one way to another. This is an argumentative way of thinking, is dialogue. The way I understand it, contemplative thinking doesn't have that dimension of going back and forth.
But I would say I wouldn't see it exclusively. So I think it's possible, and also in Plotinus, it's possible to use discursive reason and at the same time to intuitively see the forms, because otherwise we couldn't think. I mean, that if both you and I and everyone here, we are aware right now that we exist. This is not a discursive knowledge. This is
okay. Yeah. Can I ask just one thing? So you would say, because it is said, Plotinus says that we don't become aware of the intellect while we are embodied, just in rarer cases.
No. Okay, but that's a huge.
I think so. That
completely disagree. Only on rare occasion we become.
But well, maybe for example, Plotinus did. There's a debate about whether Plotinus actually could perform disconnected thinking during its lifetime.
He claims he did. Right?
Yes, but it doesn't. This is not for everyone to perform.
This is an interesting
Understanded intellect, understanding thinking.
This is an interesting point. I think why, if I may, I think why you're emphasizing dianoetic reasoning as in Plotinus as akin to Cartesianism is because Cartesians, cogito ergo sum, is because you're emphasizing the fact that dianoetic reasoning for Plotinus is self-aware, self-conscious. Whereas, and Descartes says explicitly that the cogito, right, is clear, right? The language he uses is clear, transparent, absolutely clear. So therefore, it is subject also of the self-conscious for Descartes. Yet what it isn't for Descartes, it is not a demonstration. There is no demonstration in the cogito ergo sum. If you want to break it down in a syllogistic form, as you would for discursive reasoning arguments, you can't. It is something like an intuitive grasp, but it is, and in that sense, it would sound more like Platinian noesis.
Yeah, but that is an
But you would say that Platinian noesis is not self-conscious, whereas it's sort of paradigmatically self-conscious in Descartes. So I think that is maybe the point of disagreement between the two.
I think following the path
Has to do with consciousness.
of Lloyd Gerson, who believes that contemplation of the forms is possible
But
only in this current state. But this is debatable. So I think Plotinus first. I think noesis is self-aware, because I think we are using terms like consciousness in completely different ways. So for me, noesis is of course self-aware, self-transparent, but not in a self-object separated way. But I think in Plotinus you can find many instances of the experience of the world of forms in the sensible world and through the sensible world in the incarnate state. So I challenge this idea that it's only brief moments of ecstasy. This is a great myth of Plotinian scholarship, that those experiences are rare. I don't find any evidence.
But if we experience the forms in here, it's mediated experience, it's mediated knowledge of the forms. The intuitive knowledge of the forms is not mediated by the natural world.
Yes, if you mean the experience, yeah, okay. So if you mean the experience of the forms when I don't feel my body, I don't have any sense perception, those states are rare, we all know that, right? But there are other experiences of forms when the sensible world becomes transparent. And like through a clear window, you see the forms. You still see the window if you look through the window, but you just don't pay attention to it. So it's mediated, but the mediation is thinner and then thinner.
Yes, but that is through the intellect, not through reason, imagination, or sense perception. We have access through the intellect that for Plotinus is not embodied.
So, but how about the imagination experience in 589 when you imagine through the transparent sphere and you see all the world in the transparent sphere, then all the sense of materiality disappears, and then there is the advent of the descent of the intellect, when it's all kind of embodied through imagination, through reasoning, so hierarchical levels of experience. They become a set of transparent like window panes. I think this is rather that kind of view in Plotinus than that we have to either have a sensible experience or intelligible experience.
I think there's a difference between intelligible experience that is mediated and not mediated. And also I wanted to ask you what you think then of the passage. I think it's to I don't remember, but he compares the activity of discarnate thinking to the vegetative soul, to the digestion and what happens in our body, the breathing that we don't become aware of unless we pay attention. And he compares the undescended intellect to this kind of physiological activities. So I think there is making a precise point that the undescended intellect is unperceived, or at least mostly unperceived. Unfortunately, I don't remember the exact passage.
There's a passage in 3.8 that I quoted and put up where there's Plotinus does want to speak about the undescended soul as not having aesthesis. Now, aesthesis here, Plotinian commentators often translate
sensibility
as in the sense of actually self-awareness and consciousness, not aesthesis, just in the sense of not sunaesthesis, but reading it as though it is aesthesis. And that's plausible because there are passages where Plotinus is really talking about sunaesthesis.
5.1.12.
Exactly, as aesthesis as opposed to sunaesthesis. And in that passage in 3.8 that I put up, where he is the famous case where he's saying, I am going to dare, he uses the language of Tolma, to speak about the undescended soul. He does mention the difference that comes from that state and the state that has aesthesis. Now, the question again, I'm thinking about your disagreement, is whether or not there remains even sunaistasis at the level of the descended intellect for Plotinus. In a sense, it would be something like paradigmatic.
But he specifically says
Yeah.
intellect has to.
Exactly, it's exactly the paradigmatic sunaistasis. And the question then is become, how does that connect to sunaistasis here and now? That is the real question. It's not whether or not,
Participation.
it's not whether or not there isn't any up there, to speak like Plotinus, it's whether or not in the here and now, the sunaistasis that we have is somehow still the sunaistasis up there.
Yeah, it's causality because we have it here, because we have it up there.
But there's participation. I think what I missed in your presentation was was participation as this key link between all those levels, right? So sense perception participates in imagination, imagination and reason and intellect and the one. So everything is this series of spheres within spheres within spheres, rather than. I think when Plotinus distinguishes between levels, he does it for analytical reasons,
I totally agree with
didactic
you.
reasons.
I totally agree
But
with you.
the experience of reality is not this broken down.
No, in fact, maybe I should have made it more clear, but I totally agree that the experience of soul is a unitary. We are only
So now we
levels
agree.
Now we have unity.
of operations, but we don't have a bifurcation of, split or fracture within the soul. So even the relationship that I wanted to describe between the demon and the guardian is that, one in relation to the other. They don't work separately, consciousness and unconsciousness. So actually, this was my main point in the presentation. I'm sorry it didn't come up.
Well, I think since we have got to this point of relative unity, as it were, and coffee is awaiting us, we should thank Anna for a very stimulating talk and conversation.